The buildup towards the American Revolution is largely a story of missing perspectives. The British thought that after the French and Indian War, the Americans should start to help pay off some of the war debt. It was British soldiers and British taxes that paid for the French and Indian War. From the American side, they thought that their rights of Englishmen were being violated, that because they had no representation in Parliament, that they couldn't be taxed by Parliament. So we have people talking past each other, and there's a lot of conflict here because of that. The first act after the French and Indian War that really irritated the Americans was the Sugar Act. Now, this isn't because of taxes, but because of the admiralty courts that violated the idea of the jury of peers. The Americans responded by protesting the Sugar Act. They also protested by increasing the smuggling. So they were openly violating the laws now. The first direct tax that really irritated the Americans and got them in the streets shouting "no taxation without representation" was the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, don't really need to know the details. It was a tax on legal documents, things like wills, newspapers, but they even taxed things like playing cards and dice. And the Americans were upset not because of the high tax, because the tax wasn't really that high. The problem was that they were being taxed without representation. The Americans responded in three ways. The first way was they formed what's called the Stamp Act Congress. And the Stamp Act Congress wrote a letter to the king and Parliament to complain that this was not within their right. It was largely ignored. They responded two other ways. The first was through violence. The colonists formed the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty violently opposed tax collectors. They would tar and feather them, sometimes even hang them. In both cases, oftentimes the tax collectors died. This is using violence to try to change a political policy. The third way that they responded was through boycott, also called a non-importation agreement. They agreed to not import British products. Now, by this point, the Americans accounted for anywhere between a fourth and a third of all British sales. So the boycott was incredibly effective. And it's the British corporations and companies that go to the British Parliament and say, this is just not working, and eventually get the tax repealed. The British Parliament responded by increasing the number of troops here in the Americas. The troops are stationed all over. Sometimes they're even quartered in colonists' houses. Because of the increased presence of the British troops, the Americans responded by increasing their drills in the streets of what are going to be known as Minutemen, probably better called militia. So the Americans and the British are now openly conflicting with each other. This all comes to a head with the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers being threatened by Americans in the streets at night defended themselves, at least according to the court case, and killed several Americans. From the American point of view, this is British attacking Americans. From the British point of view, the Americans were becoming rabble-rousers and causing problems. In the end, though, what this is important is that it alienated the Americans and continued the frustration started with the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act.